Okay, welcome. I thought I'd put a bit of colour and randomness into this. We're looking at chapter 10. We're looking at theologies, plural, of liberation in Latin America and Palestine. And I think this is that's rather interesting. I know I managed to condense it into four sides of lecture notes, so it's a bit short, but hopefully there's enough to whet your appetite. We're familiar so far with how the Roman Catholics, I could say Christendom generally, had a usual tendency towards the right than the left politically. And so in a way, it is odd that in the mid-60s, 70s, height of the Cold War, the church suddenly unambiguously aligns itself with the oppressed and swings in the other direction. Usually we start with our God and our Bible in our approach to things, but here's Gustavo Gutierrez, and his approach is to start with, well, where are your context and reflection and prayer with the people, sitting with the people in the midst of their setting and what that brings. So his argument is that salvation is about more than just souls, but the whole salvation and liberation. This is about creating a just society. Now, we did see that in the last chapter when we looked at who was that person who was keen to see salvation moving away from a Christocentric salvation and making Jesus king into seeing a broader sense of how this is manifesting the love of God to all humankind. This is calling on a bigger view of the gospel than what should we say, merely saving of souls. So here we are in chapter 10, and we find Gutierrez, and he is in the slums and in the military juntas, and he's thinking, how do you preach a gospel into this? How do you preach into this setting? And so from this comes his liberation theology. Now, spoiler alert, and we will come to this eventually, but Pentecostalism will end up eclipsing liberation theology by taking a very different route to the goal of salvation for the poor. But as I say, we'll come to that in a few chapters' time. So, liberation theology, this is out of which has come BECs, base ecclesial communities, and they are lay-led home groups, you and I would probably call them, where the priest will come around eventually on his sort of monthly circuit and bring the sacraments. But at this point in between, you can support each other and encourage each other with the word. And so here's a rise of lay people, here's a rise of scripture, and here's a rise of empowering your own people. Meanwhile, Roman Catholics, with their fear of communism, particularly in the light of the Cuban Revolution, and this is pushing Christians, particularly in this setting, Catholics, to identify themselves with the poor. There's a growing disillusionment from the 1950s. The Northern economists' advice, what had seemed to work quite well for them, does not seem to be working quite so well for the poor. The poor seem to be made poorer, and it doesn't quite seem to work this out. I'm curious about what their advice was. My first degree of philosophy and economics, I kind of flunked the economics, so I would be curious to sort of learn more about that growing disillusionment with a northern approach, northern hemisphere approach to things. And so we see in Latin American liberation theology what this uses picking up on the Old Testament motif of the promised land as a utopian metaphor. And we'll see about how that doesn't really resonate quite so well in Palestine. But let's focus for a moment on Latin American liberation theology. And here you've got some key names: Ruben Alves, More Gutierrez, and a bit of papal encyclicals. And the key thing here is we're picking up on the Exodus as the paradigmatic act through which God forcibly revealed his liberating nature to Israel. So this is the Exodus story as saying, this is what God is like. This is what he wants for his people, to be free and liberated. And so that's that driving force behind this theology, which leads to this preferential option for the poor. Cardinal Ratzinger, not so keen to see the Exodus was kidnapped. His concern there is seeing the scriptures reduced to merely a political level. Never that keen on this phrase merely, but what does he think he's doing? Elevating the scriptures to merely a spiritual level. That there's no challenge to culture and to society and to politics. So we have in liberation theology, they have their own martyrs. Oscar Romero is the one to be pointing to, and there's Ignacio la Curia, 1980s, 1989. So they've got their own martyrs. Palestine. Let's have a little look at Palestine. And here we come across this marvelous man, Naim Atik. I met him. I had no idea he was significant and important at the time of that. Never mind. That's a shame. But I met him when I was in Jerusalem. One of the things that I have found, when I read my scriptures, and you read certain phrases like this one from Isaiah. Therefore, the sovereign, the Lord of hosts, the mighty one of Israel, I will pour out my wrath on my enemies and avenge myself on my foes. Now, when you're a good village Anglican, you read that and go, yes, well, basically this is talking about the importance of being nice to people, and you find a broad and bland, generic way of preaching it that encompasses all people. Now, I challenge you: go out to Israel, read the same text sitting there. On some hot desert piece of rock, and suddenly it resonates differently. And scripture speaks certainly to me differently when I find myself sitting in different places. I will pour out my wrath. The mighty one of Israel, the Lord of hosts, the mighty one of Israel says, I will pour out my wrath on all my enemies. So you read that in Israel, it reads a bit differently. So for Naim Atik, the issue of the Jewish exodus from oppression in Europe is the rationale for their conquest. So this is why he doesn't like using the Bible Exodus as the key underlying basis for liberation theology, because he sees the Jews coming over from Europe, and in their eyes released from oppression in Europe. And so in a sense, the Exodus motif becomes their rationale for their conquest of their land. I'm struggling here with finding the right words. This will be fun to write an essay on. So this is why Naim Atik not so much in favor of the Exodus motif, because it so resonates with the Jews as they come over to occupy the land. Meanwhile, Naim Atik, he favors the prophetic tradition. So he's not keen on the exclusive nationalism of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, but he does like a bit of Jonah. Here we find the archetypal Palestinian liberation theologian. Here we find a message of radical opposition to a narrow Jewish nationalism. You've got some embarrassing statistics there to do with the reduction of Christians in the Holy Land. And you've got the rise in 1990 of the Tantur Ecumenical Institute. I went there in 1995. And there, Naim Atik established Sabil as an ecumenical liberation theology center, as a movement there. You've got stuff here on the PLO. I didn't know that. And you've got stuff here on the Six-Day War and how the approach of that led to a rise of two issues that we will see. You've got these Catholic Middle Eastern theologians who were complaining the divine vocation of Israel was to be a witness to all the nations, not to be itself a nation. The nation of Israel was a racist state born out of violence. This is a quote from Stanley, you understand. Um, here you've got some quite vocal points being made. So you've got a resource, Sabil. So if you do find yourself writing on this essay, Sabil, very useful resource. I haven't checked out Al-Dhikar, which seems to be slightly different in terms of being a center that works for all Palestinians. I think I've been to their headquarters in Jerusalem. I certainly went somewhere back in 2010 that was to do with this towards the north side, north of the city. So what we're looking at here, then, the God who acts, is we're looking at a theology of liberation that wants to use the Exodus motif. Very good for Latin liberation theology. Very good for African Black theology arising differently. Alan Baysack bringing that forward, but Naim Atik not being so keen on this. For him, he has two struggles. He has the struggle of the rising Zionist state, depriving them of their land. And he also, as a Christian, finds himself having to work out how he lives in an Islamic environment. And so that's why, in a sense, you've got these two movements. You've got the Sabil as it looks at liberation theology, and you've also got Al-Lika as it explores how to live in this new context. That will do for chapter 10. See you shortly for chapter 11.